Last week, I counted down my favorite horror games from the old school era, and now I'm back this week to talk about the best horror games from the 16-bit era, the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo, and the TurboGrafx 16. Like last week, there's only going to be one game per franchise on the list. So, without further ado, here we go with my favorite and the 16 best horror games of the 16-bit era. Kicking off this list is Nosferatu for the Super Nintendo. This is a game that plays a bit like Prince of Persia and takes some time to get used to, but it's worth checking out. It has some great imagery and graphics that go along with it, with some really eerie and underrated music. It has kind of a fighting game system when it comes to the actual boss encounters, and a lot of story and cutscenes along the way. It is by no means the best game on this list, but for horror fans, if you've never seen it, I definitely recommend checking out Nosferatu. Definitely one of the more obscure games on this list, Musha is a game that is themed around Japanese horror and folklore. You play as a character with a spear, and it's very Castlevania-esque in the way that the game is designed, and is quite challenging. It has some okay music, though definitely not the best amongst the games on this list, but if you are a fan of horror and the Castlevania-like games, you may want to give a shot to Musha. Of all the games on this list, this is probably the one that people have heard of the least. Mizuno is a very obscure Japanese-only for the Super Famicom game. It, like Musha, is a Castlevania-esque experience, though your main character actually has a gun. There's a bunch of different levels that have hellacious and demon-filled things, and has actually demon transformations, a little bit like the likes of Altered Beast. While it's not the most difficult game, especially when you get those demon transformations, but if you're able to get a chance to play this one, it's well worth your time. One of the most unique games on this list, Haunting starring Poulter, has you playing as a poltergeist named Polterguy. It's for the Sega Genesis and one of those games I didn't discover until many years after its release, and the gameplay takes a bit to get used to, but basically, you're trying to get rid of the residents of a house by scaring them. You actually get to possess and set up traps in order to scare them, with a lot of great traps and animations to go along with everything. It will take a bit to get used to this game, but it's well worth doing so, as Haunting starring Polterguy is definitely a hidden gem. One of my absolute favorite games on the Sega Genesis, Decapitac. I absolutely love this game. You play as a mummy who actually has his eyes that bulge out of his wrapping in order to actually hit and take out enemies. You can find a skull head and use it in order to throw at enemies and take them out. There's potions that can be used to upgrade, and just overall some great atmosphere with some awesome horror-inspired graphics, and I absolutely love the main theme. If you for some reason have never given it a try, definitely do yourself a favor and check out Decapitac. While I didn't include a game from this series on my previous list, I had to here, and I put Demon's Crest, my personal favorite of the Gargoyles Quest series, and my personal favorite of all the Ghosts and Goblins games. You play as Firebrand, the gargoyle who has so many awesome powers that you're able to obtain throughout the course of the game, and you need to use these abilities in order to explore and find the items needed in order to complete the game. It has a great soundtrack and epic boss encounters to pull everything all together. Demon's Crest is a fantastic game, not only a great horror one. While this series only saw a few releases in North America, the Clocktower series is not only fantastic, but the original Clocktower for Super Famicom is easily one of the best 16-bit horror experiences you can have. Trying to make your way through the mansion is a point-and-click adventure, which may not be for everyone, but it's the horror, the tension, something that you really didn't think you could get out of a system like the Super Famicom, but this game does it, and it does it beautifully. Those sound cues kick in, the Scissor Man makes his appearance, and you're desperately trying to run away and escape from those massive pair of scissors. Clocktower is an absolute stellar horror experience, especially one that came out during the 4th generation. Well, I could have easily put all 3 of the games from this series on this list alone. Splatterhouse 2 is absolutely a fantastic action horror game on the Sega Genesis. You play as Rick, who gets possessed by the Terror Mask. You're trying to save your girlfriend Jennifer. There are some awesome boss encounters and some really great music that go along with all these really intense moments. While all 3 of the Splatterhouse games of the era are very enjoyable, Splatterhouse 2 will always be my personal favorite. If you know horror of this era, you probably saw this one coming a mile away, but Zombies Ate My Neighbors is one of the absolute best games of that generation. You have 2 main characters, you can play the game co-op, and then you blast your way for level after level, trying to save your neighbors, as well as killing all the vast amount of monsters and creatures, most of which are inspired from classic horror movies, as well as many of the game's levels' names are based on these horror titles, as well as other pop culture references. Zombies Ate My Neighbors, if for some reason this is one you've never played, this is definitely one of the highlights of the Super Nintendo era. Before we get to number 1, let's look at a couple of honorable mentions. It Came from the Desert, a game that was inspired by the 1950s atomic monster movies, specifically the movie Them, has you battling gigantic killer ants. It has FMV sequences all throughout it, which are absolutely amazing, with pun intended there, as well as this adventure-style gameplay as you're making your decisions on where to go, mini-games for you to battle the ants, and of course plenty of action destroying these massive, gigantic ants. This game isn't the best by any means, but the pure cheese factor to it makes it worth an honorable mention. Devil's Crush is a pinball game available on the TurboGrafx CD with a great rocking soundtrack to go along with it. It has all the imagery of horror and hell themes throughout playing it, and it's a really well-playing pinball game available on the system. It's not necessarily like a true horror game by any means, but just that theme and the music that goes along with it was why I ended up including it on this list. If you are a fan of gore like I am, one of my favorites, while not a horror game, I felt like would be a nice little mention here, is the Sega CD version of Eternal Champions. It takes forever to load the killing fatality type moves, but when you do, these things are absolutely brutal to look at. I highly recommend checking out a video of all of them, as you will definitely not be disappointed if you've never witnessed the 16-bit gore that is Eternal Champions. For the number 1 spot on this list, I went with what is not only one of my favorite Super Nintendo games, but what is one of my favorite video games of all time. Super Castlevania 4 is one of, if not the most beautiful looking game of its era, with some of the best whip physics we ever saw in any of the Castlevania series, along with one of the absolute best soundtracks that the Castlevania series ever saw. This game is action-packed, beautiful, and of course plenty of horror all around. While I also absolutely adore Castlevania Bloodlines, and it was hard not to put that one on this list as well, I have to give that little bit of a nudge to Super Castlevania. As I played that for the first time, I was absolutely blown away. So there you have it, the best horror games of the 16-bit era. Of course, like always, this is my opinion, but I'd like to hear yours as well. What is your favorite horror games from that era that didn't end up making this list? I'm going to be back next week with the 5th generation of systems, and there is an absolute ton of horror games to dive into with that one. But anyway, guys, that's going to wrap up this list. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.